explanation for how I wound up here on the stage today. In my career, both academically and in business, I've jumped around a bit like a kangaroo. I went to university in Canada, but I also went to university in Denmark, worked in financial services. So I worked in Canada as well as the US, wound up spending far too much time on Wall Street. During the financial crisis of 2008, I was running a bank, trying very hard to make sure the bank did not implode. And I saw people lose literally hundreds of millions of dollars personally. And many times when people say literally, they really mean figuratively. But there, I mean literally. And I can assure you, some of them could afford to lose $100 million, but they weren't happy about it. And one of the things I started to think is, there's got to be a reason why people are behaving this way. Because a lot of the losses were due to heuristics and biases. People were their own worst enemy. So before I get into that, I'm going to give you a little mental exercise. This is the equivalent of telling you to stand up and stretch, but it's a mental stand up and stretch, okay? So what I want you to do is think a number between 1 and 10 and keep it in your head, okay? You should have a number in your head between 1 and 10. Multiply that number by 9, okay? You should now have a 2-digit number in your head. I want you to add those 2 digits together. Okay, now I want you to subtract 5 from that number. See, this is the stretching part. Subtract 5 from that number. You should still have a 1-digit number in your head. If you have something else, something's gone horribly wrong, but that's okay. So that 1-digit number, think of the letter of the alphabet that corresponds, pardon me, think of the letter of the alphabet that corresponds to that number. A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, D is 4, E is 5, F is 6. You see how this works? Okay, you now have a letter in your head. Think of a country that begins with that letter. Okay? You now have a country in your head. Take the last letter of that country and think of an animal. Okay? You should have an animal in your head now. If you still have a number, once again, something's gone horribly wrong, we can talk at lunch. Okay, you should now have an animal in your head. I want you to take the last letter of that animal and think of a color. How many of you came up with orange? That's the favorite BEworks color. All right, what I'm going to talk to you about is investor overconfidence. And this really was me looking at spending a lot of time in the investment industry saying, why do people just refuse to get advice when they really, really should? This is a global study that showed that 61% of millennials believe that they have a greater than average understanding of investments, but only 32% of them could identify what an investment management company does. So they think they know more than average, but they don't even know what an investment management company does. Okay? Mark Twain said, it's not what you know or you don't know that kills you, it's what you know for sure that ain't true. People think they know a lot more than they really do. Here's a great piece that came out recently from TD, where it shows that millennials who are about to inherit all this money, 83% of them said they know they're going to receive money, but they feel perfectly comfortable managing it themselves without getting advice. And yet, when you go and talk to people of an older generation who received money, 46% of them said they wish they'd received advice. So why do you have this difference between people who think they can do it without advice and then they learn? So judgment comes from experience. Experience comes from a lack of judgment. You have to actually experience it before you have a realistic assessment of what you really know. What we like looking at in terms of our methodology is behavioral diagnostics, right? So the usual suspects are, well, we can explain people's behavior by looking at their gender, their net worth, their home ownership, education, risk aversion. I've seen all the segmentation in industry on investment advice, and those are often segmentation bases. The problem is those describe the people rather than their behavior. If you want to understand their behavior, you have to look at what their intentions are, how those attitudes are, how those attitudes then cause them to form intentions, and then how those intentions are then resulting in behavior. So what's your attitude towards advice? What are you going to do? Are you going to get advice? And then do you actually go and get it? So there's direct and indirect measures. Most people would suspect that decision difficulty or perceived risk or ability to make a self-determined decision or ability to identify preferences or satisfaction with decision making, that those should all predict people's intention towards seeking advice and their subsequent behavior. So they may have this expertise or lack of expertise, but then you can look at other things. Subjective knowledge, right? What's their financial literacy? What do they really know? Subjective knowledge, what do I think I know? And then confidence, how confident am I in my ability to make financial decisions in the absence of advice? Okay? So, reframing, from this morning when George was talking, the assumption is Homo economicus, that these rational, utility-maximizing consumers will recognize their inability to make complicated financial decisions, and of course they will go and seek professional financial advice because they recognize that the failure to do so will have enduring negative consequences for their health, happiness, well-being, and their offspring. Duh, it's obvious. But they don't. Okay? There's something called the Dunning-Kruger Effect. And it shows that people with lower levels of expertise actually have a tendency to overestimate their ability to perform complex tasks. So one way you can look at their expertise in investment decision making is give them a financial literacy test. What do you really know? The other way is to say, what do you think you know? Right? That goes back to the millennials who think they're experts when in reality they don't want to know what an investment management company does. Finally, overconfidence is the extent to which your subjective knowledge, how much you think you know, is significantly higher than what you do know. If you look at how those would work in a quadrant, right? So these people, these subjective novices say, I really don't know that much, okay? But they're actually, objectively, they do quite well on a financial literacy test. So these are the good ones, okay? They say, I really don't know how this investing works, but they actually do know more than they think. These are the dangerous ones. These are the ones who say, I'm an investment expert, and then they fail a financial literacy test utterly. So we did a bit of a study, right? We had 171 BCom students. They were given a simulated investment decision. They put $250,000 into 50. These were real mutual funds drawn from a real database, so it was a real accurate study, representative of reality. They looked at 1, 3, 5-year terms, standard deviation. After constructing the portfolio, they were then offered professional advice. Would you like a professional to review your selection, right? Some said yes, some said no. So running a binomial logistic regression model, looking at it, saying which of all of those attitudes was useful in predicting whether they would or wouldn't get advice. And you should suspect from that, but what I was saying is that all the usual suspects, in fact, did not matter. Right? It didn't matter whether they could identify preferences, were satisfied, whether they found it difficult, whether they were able to make a self-determined decision, their risk appetite, what they thought they knew, their objective knowledge, what they really knew, their objective knowledge, what they thought they knew, their subjective knowledge. None of those predicted advice seeking. The only one that did was this overconfidence. People who really believed that they knew what they were doing, whether they did or didn't. So you may say, so what? We have these overconfident investors, what could go wrong? Well, I can remember people saying that on Wall Street in 2007. What could go wrong? What did go wrong? So what happens is, the blue line, the dotted blue line, those are the people who accepted advice. And the vertical axis is the proportion that they invested of their portfolio in equities. Now, the mean of the 100 best performing long-term pension funds is 58.9%. Okay? That's about what you should have for a long-term investment. So the ideal is somewhere, here, right? The people who, as their confidence increased on the x-axis, you can see the more confident they got, the more and more money they put into equities. And it was bad for people who accepted advice subsequently, and you can expect that the advisor would correct their poor decision-making. But look what happened to the people who refused advice. They went over 85% equity. Okay? That is far too much risk. That is not a good investment decision. And what's driving that is the overconfidence. So it's overconfidence rather than some of these other appealing or intuitively appealing factors that really determine people's decision regarding advice. Right? And by the way, that's why financial literacy training actually doesn't do very good at changing the way people invest. Because it's not about what they know or what they think they know. It's about how overconfident they are. What we really have to do is nudge people towards a more realistic assessment of what their actual capabilities are. And I've done lots of marketing of investment products, and I can say now, without fear of shame, that for decades I was doing it wrong. Because I was focusing on the things that I thought shaped attitudes and intentions, when really it's these irrational, psychologically motivated or psychologically driven choosers that are subject to heuristics and biases that they aren't even aware of. And that's one of the interesting aspects of behavioral economics, because that is what we use. That is how we look at it. We don't assume that it's the things that you might think, and then you have to run an experiment, right? It's not just what you think you know is true. You actually have to run an experiment so you know it's true. An interesting idea here is, how do you get people to have a more realistic assessment of what they know? We're all kind of embarrassed. I have a hypothesis that one of the reasons why travel sites work so well is people felt a lot more comfortable in their own home, in front of their computer, not having to reveal their ignorance or lack of understanding with respect to travel to someone over the telephone. If someone could sit at home and very comfortably realize that they really don't know as much about investing and they're too overconfident and they run the risk of decisions, they may make better decisions. Key takeaways here: sound investment decision making is really an important determinant of long-term financial well-being for all of society. We have to discard the assumption that consumers are rational, utility-maximizing decision makers, and we simply have to present them a chart of 5-year returns with standard deviations and betas, and they'll make the right investment choice. They don't decide things that way. That's not the way they operate. And sending them all kinds of, glossy marketing materials with charts and graphs and showing the returns is really not helping them become better investment decisions. The other thing is, hypotheses should be tested in advance. It sounds perfectly rational to say that, consumers are driven by risk aversion, and that if they can understand the riskiness in the market and the returns, that they'll make good decisions. We'll test those assumptions, and when you test it, you find out that's not true. None of that is correct. Right? It's important to test the hypotheses that we often use to make business decisions. And I think the final thing is that behavioral economics uncovers some really powerful ways to look at consumers differently and make much better decisions than would otherwise be the case. Thank you.